Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast with Jonathan Rapping. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
Welcome to another episode of Gideon's Promise. And this month we are actually celebrating Individual Rights Day, which is August 29th. It is the birth date of John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher, and it really celebrates the aspirational idea that individual rights are so critical to our democracy. I say aspirational because, as we all know, that promise remains unfulfilled for so many people, and that's what we're really going to be talking about today. You know, as I often say, it's so easy in an overburdened system that really prioritizes efficiency and processing cases to just fail to see the human beings who are impacted. In courtrooms across America, people accused of crimes are reduced to the mistakes they made. Judges and prosecutors often don't take time to learn about the person behind the case. And public defenders are frequently just too overwhelmed to take the time to learn these stories, and often aren't trained to effectively tell the stories. Frequently, it appears that everyone is just resigned to playing their role in moving cases along. Today, the United States is the world's largest incarcerator, with 25% of the total global prison population. In the era of mass incarceration, with 2.2 million people behind bars, 1 out of every 100 adults is locked up. It's more important than ever to know and protect our individual rights. Let's talk about that.
So, you know, I am very excited today to have some amazing and powerful women join us on the podcast. We are thrilled to be joined to have a conversation about individual rights. Molly Gill is the Vice President of Policy for the DC-based nonprofit FAMM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. She coordinates campaigns across the country advocating for sentencing reform and the end of mandatory minimums. Sentences created by Congress or state legislatures, which the judge must impose on a person convicted of a crime, regardless of the unique personal or social circumstances surrounding the act. Molly has 15 years of experience in the legal field and serves as a commissioner on the District of Columbia Sentencing Commission. Molly, welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast.
Thanks so much for including me on the show.
And also joining us is Sagan Soto-Stanton. She is married to Terrence Stanton, who has been incarcerated since 2013. He was originally sentenced to life in prison for crack conspiracy, which has been reduced now to 25 to 30 years. And in my opinion, that is still a life sentence.
Way too long.
He is set to be released in 2039. She has been navigating parenthood with a spouse behind bars and raising their 2 children without Terrence's physical presence or financial support. She has been advocating since his incarceration all of this time and is also advocating for his medical treatment while he is incarcerated. Sagan, welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor.
We are so excited to have this conversation from the perspective of a family member who who is touched by this system, and the advocates behind these families who've been fighting for men. Let me just tell you, Molly, I've been a fan of FAMM for a very long time.
Say that 10 times
I know,
fast.
say that a few times fast. And so I'm very excited to hear about your work, the organization's work, Cejan, your advocacy for your husband and many, many people like him. So I want to just get going, Rapis, if that's okay with you.
Jump in.
So Cejan, you've known your husband, Terrence, almost all of your life. He was originally sentenced to life in prison and is now set to be released in 2039, which means when released, he will have served a 26-year sentence. Can you tell us a little about your journey and how we came to this sentencing of Terrence years ago?
Absolutely. My goodness. Personally, my husband turned himself in 2012 with the expectation from his lawyer that he would be released immediately. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. My husband had to sit in jail until his court date, which was in 2013. He was unfortunately sentenced to life in prison with his co-defendant, Rodney Scott. Needless to say, I can't really fathom what I was going through at the moment after hearing something like that your father of your children was sentenced to life for a nonviolent drug charge. But at that time, our youngest was 1. And so for me, not being able to really process what just happened, I mean, honestly, I had to hit the ground running, immediately thinking about my next steps. And one of the things that I made sure that I completed was my undergrad. Graduated. And I also discussed with my mom, it's interesting. I discussed with my mom, I said, Mom, I really need to think about my next steps. And I'm thinking about moving 4 hours away to Atlanta. And thinking about the time period, my mother said to me, she said, Cejan, if you take this leap of faith, just know that you only have 7 months to really make something happen. I'll watch your children for you, but you're going to have to figure it out. Why? Because I'm going to Africa for missionary work. So I can't even really tell you how traumatizing those 7 months were, taking that job in Atlanta and really coming up with a plan for my kids. So by the good grace of God, I was able to buy a house because, of course, being a single parent, you can't afford $1,000 rent plus $500-600 a month for childcare expenses. So I bought a home. And then living in Atlanta, it's so competitive. The job market is so competitive. So of course, staying in Atlanta for a couple of years, I realized I need to go back to school. One of the things that I said to myself is that my children are already dealing with the void of in their lives by not having their dad there. And so I wanted to make sure that I was able to provide and really make sure that I met all of their needs. And so I went back to school, got my master's. And of course, certain areas in Atlanta are not the best places to raise your kids. So I was like, you know what? I need to move. So I sold my first home, built a brand new home from the ground up, and accepted a new job. And so it's been challenging raising my children on my own. I have no family support still, 8 years later, living in Atlanta. It's just me and my kids. But one of the things that I know that is important going through this journey is really pouring positivity and love into my children about their dad, really letting them know how amazing that their father is. But then also making sure that I keep the communication constant with their dad. Now, as far as my advocating journey, I've met some amazing individuals these last couple of years. I partnered with Angela Stanton King, and she brought me on to World Empathy Day a couple of years ago. I've partnered with my husband's co-defendant family, Rodney Scott, and we marched in front of the chief judge's office, federal building in Augusta, Georgia, 4 different occasions where we had the pleasure of meeting several journalists and reporters. I've made a connection with Alice Marie Johnson. She was helped us get my husband's name on the list that unfortunately didn't work out the way that we wanted to earlier this year. My angel Cody, Brittany Barnett. So this advocating journey has been amazing, partnering with people like Molly from FAMM. So really, I'm just kind of hitting the ground running. And this is what my journey has been so far.
Well, I'll tell you, Cejan, I want to echo Illy's sentiments. Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, you're really an inspiration. I mean, you haven't just hit the ground running. You've been sprinting in a way that few can keep up with. So thank you. Thank you so much for your work. And Molly, thank you for your work, because FAMM has really been a leader in the fight to dismantle this system of mandatory minimums. I don't think we can really talk about mandatory minimums without understanding the war on drugs that started in the 1970s, really ramped up considerably in the 80s and 90s. And I wonder if you could just share with our audience a little bit about the connection between that war on drugs and the system of mandatory minimums that we're dealing with today.
Sure. Our federal mandatory minimum drug sentences are almost as old as FAMM. They're 35 years old. They were created at the federal level in 1986, and it was the way all mandatory minimums essentially are created. There were a lot of scary headlines about this new drug called crack that we had not encountered before, that was, ravaging communities, especially urban communities, and people were frightened. They didn't understand this drug. People thought if you try it once, you'll be addicted forever. There was a lot of media around the sort of proliferation of, quote unquote, crack babies. And these were very scary headlines. And at that time, sort of crime was also just sort of generally going up around the country. And people in Congress wanted to look responsive to that. And this happens all the time. There's some high profile crime problem, and lawmakers want to be seen to be doing something about it. And the easiest thing for them to do is, well, let's slap a really harsh mandatory punishment on it, and that will make the problem go away. And here we are 35 years later, and we still have drug problems in this country with different drugs now. Now it's more heroin and opioids and fentanyl that are sort of the problem drugs and the scary drugs. And sure enough, we see members of Congress as well as state lawmakers clamoring to create mandatory minimum sentences for opioids and for fentanyl. So we keep repeating this history of sort of overreacting with the wrong solution, as opposed to focusing on what the right solution could be, and thinking about the long-term consequences of our actions. The mandatory sentencing laws that we created in 1986 have now impacted an entire generation of people. And the crack laws have impacted mostly young Black men. So an entire generation of young Black men have been hammered with these extremely harsh mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine. And we are still today trying to get Congress to correct that mistake.
No, that's such an important point, that the sort of disparate impact on communities of color. Black boys are significantly more likely than their white counterparts to be incarcerated. In fact, 1 in 3 Black male children can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. 1 in 6 Latino children. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how these mandatory minimums have contributed to this racial disparity in our criminal legal system.
Sure. I mean, one of the primary culprits is the federal mandatory minimum sentencing scheme for crack cocaine. Now, in the federal system, you have 2 sets of mandatory minimums, one for crimes involving crack cocaine and one for crimes involving powder cocaine. And essentially, John, if you and I were both selling the same kind of drug, but you sold 18 times more than I did, we would get the same sentence if I was selling crack and you were selling powder cocaine. And that's been, called the 18-to-1 disparity. The disparity between the amounts we use to sentence crack and powder cocaine cases used to be worse. It used to be 100-to-1. So you would be punished 100 times more harshly for powder cocaine than for crack cocaine. And what the data has shown from the moment these laws were created in 1986, even up till now today, is that 80% of people sentenced for crack offenses are Black. And it's mostly white and Latino people who are sentenced for powder cocaine. Wow. But crack and powder cocaine, chemically, they're identical drugs. We shouldn't be sentencing them differently. 42 states around the country don't sentence them differently, but the federal government persists in doing that. And so we're very excited that several members of Congress have introduced the Equal Act in both houses. It's bipartisan, bicameral bill to get rid of once and for all this different treatment between crack and powder cocaine, because it has been a major driver of racial disparity in the federal prison system.
Well, thank you for your work on that. It's important, so important.
So I know, Sagan, you mentioned earlier when you were taking us through the journey, your journey about when your husband was arrested and was told, he was going to be able to go home, and then now he has this 30-year sentence. The legal representation he received, can you talk a little bit about that? And did you feel like he got the best legal representation?
And actually, did he have a public defender station?
No, he didn't. We actually hired a lawyer. So my husband's lawyer, I guess to answer your first question, my husband's attorney wasn't effective during his pretrial stage. So my husband was misclassified as a career offender during his entire plea negotiations, causing his plea to increase an additional 10 years. So because my husband felt that his priors didn't qualify for him to have those enhancements, he rejected the plea and proceeded to trial, and unfortunately he lost. So at sentencing, it was discovered that my husband did not qualify for the career offender enhancement, and his lawyer, Jock Hawk, called the misclassification as a technicality. And then also for your second question, the answer is no. My husband doesn't feel that his attorney fought for him the way that he deserved. If not for his attorney's negligence, he would have received a plea that was applicable to him, and he would have been home a long time ago. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Molly, over 80% of the people who come into the system qualify for a public defender. And Sagan just said her husband had a private attorney who did not do his due diligence, right? And we train public defenders to do their due diligence, so things like that happen to Terrence that don't happen. But how public defenders advocate, how can public defenders, Molly, best advocate for their clients when prosecutors bring forward charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences? So in Terrence's case, it was a private lawyer, but let's say it was a public defender. Heck, let's say it's Terrence's lawyer. How can they best advocate so these things don't happen?
The most important thing we can do in terms of evening out the scales of power in our courthouses is to get rid of these mandatory minimum sentences. The National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers has done a lot of good work on this concept of the trial penalty, that people get punished for exercising their constitutional right to have a jury trial, to have a jury look at the facts and decide if you're guilty or not. And the reason for that is that if you say you want to go to trial, the prosecutor will come in and slam you with a bunch of charges that carry mandatory sentences. Right. And now you're looking at losing decades of your life if you go to trial. So people, of course, plead guilty. Most people, think our courtrooms look like, law and order. In fact, most of our courtrooms would be pretty dull for people just strolling through, because most cases end in plea bargains. 97% of cases in this country don't go to trial, and a big part of that is because of mandatory minimum sentencing. So FAMM put out a documentary on the trial penalty last year. It's called The Vanishing Trial. You can find information about it at our website. And it sort of tells 4 stories of people this happened to, and this happens at the state level and at the federal level. So we need to get rid of these mandatory sentences, and there is a role for public defense to play in that. I think, meeting with your lawmakers, educating them about these laws, sharing your personal experiences of working in the courtroom, and having these bad plea bargain and bad plea offers. I think that is valuable. Lawmakers need to understand that and understand how this system really works.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, because I listen to you and I hear you saying that public defenders have a role to play beyond the courtroom, have a role to play in joining with impacted communities to advocate for legislative change. And in fact, because public defenders are in the spaces where so much harm is done, they actually bring an informed and personal knowledge of the system to the table. But at the same time, I mean, obviously, we spend our lives training public defenders to push prosecutors and judges who come to see people as widgets, really as something subhuman that can be processed through the system, to understand that there are stories, that there are mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, and our hope is that when they understand the value of the person before them, perhaps they will realize that throwing away a life so callously is a mistake. And I just wonder, in this discussion about criminal justice reform, there is a lot of talk about a lot of the reforms that you're talking about, and they're important, but public defenders have largely been ignored. And I wonder if you think that's a mistake, and if you think that, although understandably mandatory minimums make the work hard, do good public defenders matter? Should people want good lawyers? Do they make a difference?
I would say they absolutely make a difference. I mean, remember that every person who's wrongfully incarcerated, at a minimum, is someone that you and I are paying taxpayer dollars to incarcerate, which is not a cheap proposition. So taxpayers should be interested in a justice system that isn't sending the wrong people to prison. And frankly, that's true whether people are guilty or innocent. Part of the reason I stepped away from prosecution and decided to work on reforming the system was that I saw that we were putting people in prison who didn't need to be there. I saw that we were giving mandatory prison sentences that made no sense. I thought, I'm not making the community safer here. I'm taking up a prison bed with someone who doesn't need to be there. Right. I'm sucking up taxpayer dollars that could be spent on something more useful. Plug that money back into the community in a positive way. And so I think, yeah, I do think that public defense in this country is, from everything that I hear and see, underfunded. And I do think that it is very important to bolster funding for that, and really try to encourage people to go into public defense as a career. I wish that we had the same prestige for lawyers leaving law school who went into public defense as we do for lawyers leaving law school and going into giant firms or clerking in federal courts.
I'm putting that on a t-shirt. You are absolutely right.
Yeah, I do think, there need to be more public defenders. We need to do more to sort of draw the best and brightest out of law school into public defense, and there does need to be more funding. And I will say too, an issue that I think is NACDL, as I mentioned, has covered quite a bit, is this issue of appointing public defenders in misdemeanor cases. There are many courtrooms where if you're just charged with a misdemeanor, you do not have a right to a public defender. And so if you want a lawyer, you have to go pay for it and find your own lawyer. And this was the case where I prosecuted, which was in Minneapolis. This was almost 20 years ago now, but I remember talking to people in that courtroom who were being charged with a misdemeanor, and having to give them this little speech of, I'm not your lawyer. I'm the bad guy. I'm the prosecutor here. I can't help you. If you want a lawyer, you have to go pay for one. And just thinking that is so wrong on so many levels. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We have a justice system that so many nations envy, and we should be able to do better than this.
Yeah. Yes. Cejan, I want to ask you. You mentioned having your husband Terrence had a lawyer. Did not do a very good job. In what ways do you think a good lawyer, if you could have had the lawyer of your dreams, how do you think that could have made a difference in Terrence's case, as well as in sort of how you as a family felt about the treatment he received?
To be honest, a good lawyer would have him home by now. A good lawyer would have prevented, all of these fees that we have. So really thinking about the single parent perspective, really thinking about the monthly expenses that we have based on the lawyer's negligence. I really think about the citizens, right? That monthly fee of supporting my husband that is being supported by not only myself, but his family members and his friends, that's roughly $350, $400 a month. Hygiene, food, clothes, emails. And again, thinking about the travel impact. My husband has been to Big Sandy in Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia in these last 9 years. So again, really thinking about those expenses, it's detrimental to not only my family, but several other people that are in the same position as me. It's a challenge. And it's unfair that he's still in this situation because, again, I can't stress it, the negligence of his attorney. And so again, it's important, and I can't stress it enough. It's important that people that are in my position that have family members or loved ones in prison, posting pictures, pouring that love and positivity. Well, I can't keep speaking of these things without taking my kids to making that sacrifice and taking my kids to go see their dad. So again, overall, it's a challenge having to do this.
Sagan, can you tell for our people who are new to listening to Gideon's Promise and maybe unfamiliar the way the criminal legal system works? You mentioned, your husband being in these different states and the amount of money that you come out of pocket to go visit him. Why is he bounced from different states? Can you explain? I know what that process is and the why, but for folks who are new to understanding how Department of Corrections work, especially on the federal level, can you explain why he's bounced from prison to prison?
Yes, absolutely. So when my husband was sentenced to life, he had the 782 drug amendment, so that enhancement. And so in federal terms, they go by a point system. So because he had a large amount of points in a federal prison, they're going to put you in the worst maximum security facility, which in his case was Big Sandy in Kentucky. That is the worst facility any inmate would want to ever go to. There's race wars. There's all type of horrible things going on. I mean, at times, I remember him first going there and that facility was on lockdown for months because of all the different things that are going on, the crimes, the deaths, the race wars, all of the above. And so the reason why my husband was moved from state to state, facility to facility, is because when you go through these different programs in prison, meaning if he wants to go through public speaking, if he wants to go through any type of career-related programs and good behavior, programs and good behaviors reduce his point system, which makes him eligible to go to from a high maximum facility to maybe a medium level facility to now 9 years later, he's at a low facility. And of course, that is more appeasing to people like my husband, because once you go from a maximum to a medium, you have more privileges. You have more freedom to move around. Visitation is different. So of course, that is more, that's motivation behind the good behavior, doing those things, going to the programs and different things like that. So that's what that technically means. And thank goodness for the First Step Act. That was a way to kind of support people like myself, to where my husband, there's a 50-50 chance that my husband may not be 500 miles away from his home address.
Right.
And then there's other occasions where facilities are closing down. And that's not always the case, where we meet that 500-mile mark.
Gotcha. So as we are honoring, we're talking about Individual Rights Day, and Sagan, as a family member of a loved one who is incarcerated, were you informed of your rights in this whole legal process? We know your husband was going through it, but in terms of you mentioned like access to him, were you originally informed of your rights, and then how did you learn about them?
To be honest with you, I wasn't informed of my rights, but everyone was introduced to those basic rights in grade school, right? And one of the ones that I think anyone can relate to is your First Amendment rights, your freedom of speech. And so with that particular right, that goes into the right to petition grants people not only the freedom to stand up and speak out against injustice, but also grants the power to help change those injustices, right? And again, that kind of aligns with a lot of the things that I do as far as advocating for my husband. So again, it's like we typically, when you're introduced to something like, for example, in school, I'm a facilitator, learning development specialist in my career. And I truly believe that when you're introduced to something and you don't use it, it typically dissolves, right? So now with me being put in this position, granted, I'm aware of my rights, but when you start advocating, when you start going through interviews and all these different things, you finally connect the dots like, oh, this is my First Amendment rights. So not only that aspect, when I really think about the nonprofit community, FAMM, Gideon's Promise, you all also play an active role by providing an organized medium to join people like myself together in support of causes, or in the petition of practices that violate their causes. So again, I'm ultimately learning from my experience, learning how these rights that were introduced in grade school, how they truly benefit me and my family.
What can we, just to add one more question to add to that, Sagan, like what are your thoughts on how we get other people to learn about these things? I think about family members like myself who had an incarcerated parent, right? Not knowing what we could or could not advocate for on the front end. How can we get this? Like, what are your thoughts on getting this information? I call to just everyday people. What could we do?
You know what? As everyday people, you know how I really learned about a lot of these opportunities? FAMM. FAMM. Automatically, when my husband went into prison, FAMM was contacting him from the very beginning, 9 years ago. And of course, you know, his focus is like, okay, what do I need to do? You know, this isn't right. There's some injustices with my case, my lawyer, the whole situation. FAMM is one of the ones that introduces this piece of knowledge to those inmates. And those inmates in turn goes and shares this information with family members like myself. So if it wasn't for FAMM contacting my husband, never giving up, asking my husband specific information about his case and constantly giving those inmates updates on what's going on in the world, how these laws may impact them. If it wasn't for FAMM, I wouldn't be in the position that I am in today. They were the ones that introduced that information to my husband, who in turn passed it along to me. But outside of that, you know, educating yourself. Honestly, I had to do a lot of Googling over the last couple of years to really learn, okay, this is not my niche. I'm more of a facilitator, financial industry. This is my realm of knowledge and expertise. And I really had to kind of, you know, slow down and educate myself. I'm still educating myself till this day because all of these laws, 782 amendments and the 846B1A, all these different charges, a lot of that stuff was new to me. So again, it takes some self-education and also organizations like FAMM to really pass helpful information off to the inmates.
So Sagan, I'm just listening to you. I've been listening to you over this past hour, and you know, I'm just, you know, I'm moved by how you talk about your husband and how the system treats him as though he's got no value. You know, just that he is a commodity that can be moved from place to place. And of course, his story is not an exception. There are people like Terrence all across this country who have just been dehumanized in the system. And I think one thing that we teach our lawyers is that it is critical that we're storytellers, that we are forcing the system to see the stories of people that otherwise they would so easily disregard and cast aside. And so Molly, I want to ask you, in sort of the spirit of sort of storytelling and the power of storytelling, is there a a case, a story that you can think of from your time at FAMM that you think really encapsulates the work you do, that really sort of motivates you to continue with the advocacy that you do? Could you share that with the audience?
Oh, it's hard to pick just one. We have so many amazing stories at our website. You can visit that at famm.org. It's FAMM.org, and click on the stories tab, and you can read until your daylight runs out, until your computer battery dies. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of these stories. I think one that really stands out to me is the case of Gideon Eccles. Gideon just got out of prison. He's been home less than 2 months, I think. And Gideon got a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence when he was 23 years old. He lost some funding for his college education and decided to make some quick cash and sell some crack cocaine. He knew he could do it. He knew he was in a neighborhood where he was able to get plugged into that, and he did. He also happened to own a gun that he kept in his home for home protection. And sure enough, when the feds came knocking, they gave him 10 years for that, the crack, and then an additional 10 years for possessing the gun. And so he got a 20-year sentence at age 23. And,
wow.
I wrote about this recently. I like to tell Gideon's story to college classes because I think it's like a mirror that we can hold up to ourselves, and it makes us question our privilege, where we came from, what we have, how we got it. It makes us question whether we might have gotten a different outcome because we're white and maybe our parents are well connected, or we come from a wealthier neighborhood or a more privileged place than Gideon did. And I love watching college students sort of grapple with, all of those sort of systemic questions that are much bigger than the criminal justice system, but which all have a bearing on the sentence that Gideon got. And, Gideon, I think, actually motivates me for a sad reason, which is that we have not been able to help Gideon. We were not able to get his sentence reduced. We passed several reforms while he was in prison. Neither one of them applied to his case and brought him home earlier. And that just kills me. I would have done anything to shorten his sentence. I would have loved to see him come home sooner. And that keeps me fighting. And I mean, frankly, the best part of this job is watching someone walk out of prison early. And it is heartbreaking when you watch someone do their full time. And Gideon did his full time. And, he's one of the people who keeps me fighting for the people who aren't out yet.
The last question I have, right, is we're talking about these policies that were enacted decades now ago, right? We were all around when they happened. These policies, as Molly mentioned, with the new war on drugs, is not what I call it, but what I've seen with fentanyl and things like that. If we are not careful, right, history can and will repeat itself, and we're seeing it now.
Right.
To wrap up with this final question, and I'll start with Molly and then Cejan, ask for you to chime in. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice on one way to, or one way to help, what would it be?
Well, I do think the most important thing you can do is to meet with your lawmakers and share your story. Cejan was talking about how much power you can hear in her voice, how much power it gives her to share her husband's story, to share Terrence's story. And I see this all the time with the impacted people we work with. Nothing is more empowering than sharing your story. And lawmakers need to hear these stories. I can go in and spout data and facts and statistics until I'm blue in the face at these lawmakers. But what moves them to action are constituents who live in their districts, right, who can't pay their water bill because they are trying to afford a visit to go see their loved one in prison after they've been there a year. So, I mean, those personal stories matter so much. I think plugging in and getting connected to your lawmakers matters so much. We need to show them the impacted people. We need to show them that real lives are at stake here, real communities are at stake, and that people aren't just talking points, that people are people. They're extremely valuable and precious to us. So I that would be my main, point of advice. And one easy way to do that is just text 21333. or text FAMM to 21333 and just the word FAMM to 21333, and we will plug you into our action network. We have opportunities to take action all the time. Actually, it is kind of an exciting time right now in Congress. There are several important reforms that I think have some chance of being passed in the next year or two. And we're working really hard on those. One of those is the Equal Act, those crack reforms that I talked about, finally getting rid of that disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Another is the First Step Implementation Act, which is making some previous sentencing reforms that Congress passed, making those retroactive. So they apply to people like Terrence, people who are still in prison. And that retroactive reform is the difference between, I was telling you Gideon's story. If right. Reforms had been made retroactive, Gideon would have come home sooner. So those are both two really important reforms. So that's the best way that people can get involved.
And then Sagan, what advice would you give our listeners, or one way to help?
To those incarcerated, I would say educate yourself as much as possible. Only through education will you begin to reverse your thoughts and shun criminal activity. When your record shows that you are not incorrigible, your chances of the prison doors opening up again for you are higher when those laws are changed, right? And so for those that are fighting for their incarcerated family members, to have faith. Our faith determines our capacity of patience. It takes faith, hard work, perseverance to attain freedom, justice, and equality. And just always remember, we're always in this together.
Before Illy wraps it up, I want to thank you both. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. So I want to say thanks, Illy.
And I'm going to say thank you too. I truly appreciate your transparency, your honesty, and Sagan, just to tell your story. I know when you have to repeat this story over and over again, and I appreciate you giving us of you, of your husband, of your children. And I think whenever family members share, it's very near and dear to my heart, because I know how challenging it can be sometimes to have to tell the story. So first, I want to thank you both for joining us. Molly Gill, the VP of Policy for FAMM, and Sagan Soto-Stanton, a family advocate for sentencing reform. And in true former fashion, I am Ilham Askia.
And I'm Jonathan Rapping.
Wrapping it up.
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast, with Jonathan Rapping. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.